who was it that, did you get an idea from somebody? Who was it that inspired you to think like that, if anything or anyone? I mean, I know you're a bright guy. I know you're full of great ideas and
Yeah,
you're
that's
very
right.
smart.
It was Google, of course.
Google wasn't around back then.
Yeah, that's right. I
Neither was
forgot. Yeah,
ChatGPT. That's my
yeah.
best friend
No,
now.
you find it funny. It was one of the first PCs with the big floppy disks, and we had Excel. That was it.
Oh,
And
man.
Word.
Like one
Radio
gigantic
Shack, the big
screen.
Radio Shack floppy.
Alrighty. Well, welcome, Mr. David Lamm, to our Atrium Developers podcast. Thank you for making the time to being here. I know that you are a legend in the Central Florida market, but I want to take a minute to introduce you. So David Lamm, notorious career building Lamm and Company partner, started it back in 1988, right?
Mostly, yes.
Okay, it's a good year. 88's a good
Right.
year. You've grown it into what it is today. I think you guys right now have over 30 employees, have done a lot of work throughout Central Florida, institutional, medical, office, development, Maitland City Center, which is a project we got to work on together.
Right.
So impressive career, architect by degree, and then frustrated huntsman.
Huntsman, huh?
Huntsman by hobby.
Well, for those who don't care much for hunting, we'll just say I'm a fisherman.
Okay.
How about that?
Fisherman. So, icebreaker question. Not a lot of people know, but we used to work together. You were the first person that introduced me to in commercial real estate development with Maitland City Center. So, can you tell us a funny or memorable moment from the time you were my boss? Be nice.
Well, there were two that came to mind, but one hit me immediately.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
So one day I look out the back door of the office and this little meme-looking person on top of a Ducati motorcycle drives up with a helmet about the size of her whole body, and the bike probably weighs 800, 1,000 pounds, 10 times her weight, but this little 4'6" or 8,
5 feet tall.
all right,
Okay.
5 foot
All right.
tall person who was standing there balancing the motorcycle on her tippy toes like a ballerina, trying to hold the motorcycle up. So that was probably one of the most hilarious. The other one that I didn't fully appreciate, but
Oh boy.
is the
We're cutting this out.
yeah. No, so I had expressed to you that I wanted my children to find their own business, and that I would welcome them if they wanted to get into construction like I did, that they would start their own business but not come into my business so I could go fishing. Needless to say, there is a human being called Emma who convinced my son while I was out of town to go talk to the president of our construction division and to get a job. So 4 days later, I come back in to work, and my son walks into my office, and I said, "Oh, son, hi, it's nice to see you. What are you doing? You coming to visit?" And he said, "No, I work here." So Emma put him up to applying for a job, and he was hired by our president of construction and now been with us for 10 years. So I have to thank you for the joy that it's brought, but it also has me working longer than I thought I would.
Well, we both know you're never going to retire.
Ugh.
So we know that. But second, Jeremy is now one of your top performers. He is killing it. I hear nothing but good things about him. So you're welcome.
Well, thank you. I am happy in the end that you convinced him, and I'm very proud of him.
You should be proud. He's doing a great job.
Great.
He's lifting the Lamm name for sure.
Thank you.
All right. Well, other than that, I wanted to start by you introducing yourself. So tell us about you, like where you're from, what are your passions, how long have you been in Central Florida proper, and what are some of the things that you like to do?
So I promised my dad I did not want to work as hard as he did, and ended up going to architecture school at the University of Florida and not sleeping for about 4 years. And when I graduated, I went back to Lakeland where I grew up and was working with a builder that I had been doing work with. And it was in those times when Lakeland was still a sleepy town. The market was still a little tentative, and I guess that would have been 1985, 86. And we worked with a big development company that had significant assets here in Orlando. And one day my boss came to me and said, "Look, I just can't keep anybody anymore. I'm closing down the shop. So I ended up getting an offer to come to work for a large development company in Orlando. They moved me here. Originally, I was going to design their industrial parks, their office parks, and do a lot of their marketing materials.
How old were you at the time?
I would have been 23,
Wow.
24.
So at 23, 24, you're already migrating into a development company with an
Right,
architecture degree
right,
and taking on like heavy projects.
right. So I walk in, they hire me, and just as they hired me, they fired their whole in-house construction executives. So I went from, in 30 days, I went from being their master conceptual designer of parks and such to running their construction division with a part-time bookkeeper, a general superintendent, and all our field superintendents. Uh, and we did everything. We had a whole floor of leasing agents. Most of those who are my age now, or some of them have retired, we're up on the upper floor.
Some names we know.
Yeah,
So Susan Ruby.
Susan Ribby, the McFaddens, the Sweeneys, quite a few folks. Um, and so the short story is in about a year and a half or less with them, I had designed, constructed about 1.5 million square feet of industrial projects,
Wow.
and then supported the backfilling of the buildings with the interior build outs through our leasing agents. And that was one of the neat things is I learned real fast is we all want to build buildings. General contractors, it's all about building buildings, right? Well, I learned that we don't build buildings unless we lease buildings. And so the biggest thing that I saw in that was the team required to make sure that the most important thing that happens is that you build projects that meet the market, that can lease up quickly, and then we get to build more buildings.
And you weren't building spec at the time. This was.
Oh, these were industrial shells, office buildings downtown. I mean, it was Denver, Orlando, Tampa, Lakeland.
Wow.
That probably had the assets in the millions of square feet.
Wow.
My guess is 6-7 million at that point in time in the 80s.
Wow.
This is about 86, 80. This is now 87. And then some people don't understand, but a lot of things change quickly. And in those years, in the early 80s, they had incentivized tax laws for capital gains treatment. So a lot of commercial real estate, CRE, was oriented towards passive income, passive losses. And that they were actually, if they didn't make a lot of money, it didn't matter because they were deducting it off their taxes. So people were investing in it like crazy. Well, in the late 80s, they changed the tax law back. And so a lot of real estate that had been underwritten under that criteria was starting to have real challenges. The old development theory was build it, grow rents, refinance it, take the cash and go do another deal. Well, what happened in the late 80s was what happens in some of the market cycles you've seen, which is they were upside down in 100% leased with rents going backwards and capital calls. So I saw the writing on the wall. And so in 88, I went out and had a partner for 3 years. And we formed a company. And then in 91, he and I split. We just went our different ways. And since then, I've been building buildings.
With Lamm and Company Partners.
With Lamm and Company Partners. And what was interesting about that period of time was the construction delivery was completely different than it is today. Back then, it was still old school. It was old school architects who drew plans, and you had to do exactly what they told you to do. They were the master builder, and we were just the grunts. But I knew there had to be a better delivery method. I saw it when we were in a development company where when you control the whole process, the outcome is better. Because you don't have a choice. You have to meet the bank financing. You have to make it successful. So as we're beating our heads against the wall, bidding projects and trying to get the next job, one of the things that really struck me one day was we were doing a lot of bank projects, and one of the recessions had hit, and there was not one bank coming out of the ground, not one, and there was 25 bidders on this one bank that finally showed up, and I said, there's got to be a better way. So one of the things, as you well know, that became sort of our little boutique niche was helping our clients treat a building as an asset. And in that asset allocation was to think of it as building net worth and asset wealth. So to get it financed, to get it designed in budget, to then bring it to the market, whether it's owner occupied or lease, speculative lease, required somebody who could see and manage the whole process. A lot of unsophisticated developers build their own buildings and they want it to be beautiful, but yet it doesn't appraise or it doesn't meet a market rent. And so we learned that instead of bidding projects, if we negotiated our fee up front, that we could work with them through site acquisition process, due diligence, land use approvals, design, and manage the budget so that the going in pricing and costs were the same as they came out with. And
Right. And I remember learning that from you when I was first learning even to how to read a pro forma or, do an underwriting model, is you always taught me work backwards. So what is the price that the client can come to?
Right.
How do we get the financing for that? And then from there we go backwards and we design what we can for that budget versus going the other way around.
I couldn't have said it better.
Right.
Most of those who are sophisticated developers know that the banks underwrite under a debt service coverage.
Right.
You back into it. It doesn't matter if you want to spend a whole lot more, you can. It's just more equity required. So
Right.
You're right. We would sit there. We know that somebody's going to pay a certain amount for land. We know that the architectural fees and the impact fees and all the
Right.
other fees and the soft costs for financing, they're fixed. I mean, they're
Right.
reasonably. So the only variable left is the building. And then if we can design the building with the biggest bang for the buck, everybody wins. And then the outcome is successful.
And would you say this was kind of the beginning back in 88, 89, the beginning of the true concept of design build?
I couldn't have said it. You said it perfectly. It was the first introduction in that time of a real contract form around design build. The only people who were doing what we call today construction management process delivery were the big multinationals on huge infrastructure projects. So down in this little world, it was still a bid process or negotiated process. So yes, it was a transition period where the philosophy of the contractor being adverse to an owner was prevalent and was not a world we wanted to live in. So when you switch hats and you become the owner's advocate, and you don't have to guard your fee with your life.
Right.
You become much more the friend of the owner, the partner of the owner, their teammate. And you know that if you're not successful, they have a problem. It had many physicians, particularly, who are having to dip into their savings or their retirement accounts because they hired a GC and team, and by the time they got done, the bank wasn't going to fund anymore, and they had to pull it out of their retirement.
And now
programs.
they have a design building that's completely out of scope and budget.
Right.
So back then, were people going primarily to the architect first,
Correct.
designing something, and then trying to go back to the contractor and getting it financed and budgeted and all that?
Exactly.
Wow, that must have been a bit of friction between contractors and architects.
Oh, back in that day, it was terrible. And public bid work can be very similar today as it was back then, and that's why we don't survive well in that.
Yeah.
It's nothing but a fight.
Well, I can see it now still. I mean, I think you can still see the fight between what somebody envisions that they want something to look like and what they can actually afford to build. And then going back to trying to fit that into a financing model, it can be very dirty.
Right.
So I personally like the process of working backwards. Like you're saying, there's some things that are just going to be the same every time with the little factors depending on whether if it's office, industrial, etc. But then when it comes down to like the actual building costs, you can always work backwards and then figure out, your budget is X. This is what you can get for X.
Right.
So you eliminate a lot of that back and forth. And I think to even some regard, the time that you would have spent in designing something, if you would have gone to the design team first, designing something, then, however long that used to take in the past, I don't know. Now, typically it's about 90 days they always say about 90 days. I don't know back then when there wasn't AutoCAD and everything was by hand. I can only imagine how long those plans could take. And then going through that entire exercise, having something designed, like, nope, we got to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, no, it's correct. There was always the word value engineering, and there's an overused term today called our team, right? Well, the team now is much more functions as a team, and it's everybody's aligned. You bring everybody on board early. If there's no threat of loss of fee, then you have nothing but become an advocate for the owner's best interest, and that's a much more comfortable place to be as a true team member for the client's success. That's where we get the repeat business that we do.
I also like the what you said about the team. So another thing that I learned working with you that I still appreciate to this day is I remember for every project we were working on or looking at, we always had the client in the initial meeting. We had the client, we had the civil engineer, we had the architect, and then ourselves that acted as, the contractor and representative to the client. But it seems like those meetings were always productive because we had the plans on the table. We were doing a page turner. We would look at every page, the civil set, the architectural set, full MEPs. And it seems like that helped address every single constraint and moving part so that we could move more efficiently on getting the final design. And I was having a conversation earlier with I don't know if you know Branson Bowen with PVC. He's also the founder and co-chair for CCC, Closers, Contractors, and Connectors. But he's also in this work now, and he's doing a lot of great work with PVC. But he just came from a meeting where he said, "Oh, I had to make sure I had the architect, the civil engineer, everybody on, because that's how we bring the team together." And I mentioned, I was like, "Well, that's the only way I know how to do it," because I learned that from David Lamm. And then even now, post COVID, like during COVID, everybody got used to the Zoom, which I think it's kind of lingered. But even post COVID, and it's helpful sometimes that I still kind of force everybody, like, "Hey, let's have an in-person meeting. Let's bring out the plans. Let's look at them because we will eliminate a lot of questions in this one meeting than going back and forth via emails or trying to get, our design team to communicate with one another and share information." So I've learned that from you. I remember that you were very strong, like, nope, everybody in the room, physically, plans, let's hash it out.
Right. You can't get it all, but you catch a lot of it during the design process. And if you can do that, the volatility goes down, the risk to the owner, the risk to the contractor, and even the risk to the subcontractors goes down. And our goal with our team member architectural and civil and engineering community is that they draw at one time.
Right.
For them, it's not really a moneymaker. If they have to go back and redraw plans, they may get
Right.
paid for it, but it's never going to be the same.
Right.
They'll never get it. So it is truly a win-win all the way through. Yeah.
And obviously you were sharing about when you started in development and you saw what was coming. You decided to make some tweaks to how you negotiated business and how you went about development, and then you implemented that in your operations with Lamm and everything that you've done. But who was it that did you get an idea from somebody? Who was it that inspired you to think like that, if anything or anyone? I mean, I know you're a bright guy. I know you're full of great ideas, and you're
that's
very
right.
smart.
It was Google, of course.
Google wasn't around back then.
Yeah, that's right. I
Neither was
forgot.
ChatGPT.
Yeah.
That's my best friend now.
You find it funny. It was one of the first PCs with the big floppy disks, and we had Excel. That was it.
Oh, man.
And Word.
Like one
Radio
gigantic
Shack, the big
screen.
Radio Shack floppy. Well, I think two things. One was I saw my bosses that the development company went down in the late 80s, lost everything.
This was also a crisis in the market back then.
Yeah, so the real estate market, and back then there was a lot of banks involved. The savings and loan crisis had hit, and what happened was it was a domino effect. Everything was cross collateralized, and one bank takes down a property, and it just is. And I felt terrible, but my boss, who was a mentor and became a partner later in life, lost millions of square feet of buildings, and it was just heart-wrenching to watch. And I thought, well, now I've watched two businesses, one a general contracting and one a development company, who didn't move with time, change with time, and had over-leveraged and wasn't paying attention and lost everything. And I just swore I would never let myself get into that position. Um, the other thing was I actually had a banker friend who partnered with a large developer from South Florida, and he shared with me the bank's format for underwriting, and it was a very simplistic sheet. You know, everybody's got these big fancy development programs, and
Yeah.
and you can make numbers
Waterfall structures and
water, yeah, and you can make all the numbers look beautiful
right.
whether they do or they don't. But this was very simple. It was a one-page deal that said, here's what the rent is, here's what the debt service coverage is, here's what the equity required is, and the mortgage amount. Period. That's it.
Hmm.
And you hand that one sheet to a banker and say, as long as the appraiser agrees with the numbers, it's done. And I thought, this is simpler than everybody makes it out to be. And so I don't know. I never had a finance class. I wasn't a major in high finance. But I started to look at the thought process, which was very simple. If I follow these criteria, these are the three variables. And if the variables all match and the appraiser agrees, it's done. And then if so, you're going to get your return as long as you watch your cost side on the back end. And if you deliver everything that you've done, then you're going to have that guaranteed return. And that was a simplistic way for somebody who has no idea how to actually calculate a capitalization rate through the discount analysis. But anyways, that's how I got to understand the numbers.
So you're very self-motivated. And I know that, you had mentors, but you were just very in tune with what was happening. You were keeping yourself informed, and then you were keeping yourself hungry for information, whether that would have been through your banker friend that exposed you to the first performa underwriting model. But it took your effort to actually dive deep and understand all this, because at that time you were probably now what, 25, 26.
Correct.
So that's a very young age to actually get into the weeds and be self-taught on these things. So what motivated, other than to obviously succeed, and I know that you wanted to build something, but what motivated you to go that extra step? Because most people don't do that.
Fear. It was just it was just fear. It's a very complex world. Back then, it was simpler than it is even today. It was fear of failure. It was fear of disappointing anybody. It was fear that, if you have children, how to get them through school and life, and how to create a future and a retirement and savings, and not become not fall into the trap that I'd seen my mentors and bosses do, which is spend and then go broke. And I didn't want to repeat that.
Not repeat the same mistakes.
Yeah.
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 What, were you already married and had your first, Jeremy was already born at the time?
I was 28 when Jeremy was born.
Okay.
So I had been in the first partnership company, and you'll find this humorous. When we decided to split, I walked in one day to my partner. I said, there's no hard feelings. I just want to go my own way. I said, I'll have a deal on the table within the next week. And I want to go do my own thing. And the only thing I ask is my son, my firstborn child, is going to be born in 30 days. I just want you to pay my health insurance until he's born. So I walked out the door, went into a little 10 by 10 office. My child was born 30 days later. I didn't have a partnership. I didn't have a company yet. And I sat there for the first 2 or 3 months learning how to do the accounting. I pretended I had a company open, and I pretended to post payroll, and I pretended to do that. And what is funny, because it takes a couple months to get your license transferred and insurance and all that. So as soon as that all hit, you mentioned her name, and it's still somebody I love dearly, is Susan Ruby. She gave me my first project by myself at that time. And I've always loved her for it. And it was successful and set the wheels in motion.
Was that first project an industrial project?
It was an interior build out. in
Okay.
an industrial project that I had actually built um, through the development company that somebody else had bought in receivership and owned it, and then we were they had leased it a bay, and I built the interior.
And that's cool to think that you probably were bringing Jeremy to the office in a little thing and just had him right there next to you as you're trying to do everything else and build a company.
That's correct. He was under the desk while we were doing bookkeeping.
See, it was meant to be.
Yeah.
He was meant to be in the company with you.
See, you saw it, you foresaw it.
So let me ask you something about what do you think is the biggest difference to anybody potentially trying to start a construction company today versus when you started? What do you think is one of the biggest challenges that people have now that maybe you didn't have or vice versa?
I would have to say the bureaucracy
Yeah.
all the way around. It is much harder in all aspects: permitting, municipalities, inspections, interfacing with subcontractors, the banking, getting a project closed and all. It much longer, much more bureaucratic. There's so much paperwork and time. Just to get your monthly draw is now takes full-time staff that you would have never had back then. So, the cost to prosecute the work is significantly higher in all aspects: time, bureaucracy, staff to supplement that, and then management, the management of the employee, the subcontractors are not trained like they were back then. They were skilled. You didn't have to.
That came from trade school. They knew their craft.
Right. And there was something for them back then. They were proud of their work. I mean, they were proud to be a carpenter, and they were proud to be a great mason. And a lot of times it was an art form in itself. Most of the work was, they were happy to produce something they were proud of, and it's gone. Maybe not 100%, but it's difficult.
I notice that now. I think more in construction. I think a lot of people that I know sometimes just get into construction because they know they just can get into it and do whatever and make a buck. And then some of them are savvy and they grow in positions in construction. But I do sense what you say, that skill set of having somebody that's like, no, this is what I do, this is what I know, is kind of not as easy to come by anymore.
Yeah, and our field personnel have to manage the subs, where in the old days the subs had a foreman, they had a teacher, and they moved up through the ranks in their craft. Now our superintendents have to, I hate to say it, but they babysit, and they have to guide them, and many times they put it in twice, 3 times. We'll get it right sooner or later. Let's just keep doing it until you get it right.
Well, I mean, that's also a way of doing it. Keep making mistakes until you get it right, but build up to it, I guess.
Well, and in the old days, there used to be a saying. I keep saying the old days. I don't feel that old, but there was a saying when a client walked in, by most general contractors. It was, pick budget, schedule, or quality. You can have 2 of the 3. Right, and it was very appropriate. People who were terribly budget conscious would, put up with something less quality or whatever. But
Right.
Now trying to manage any one of the 3 is
It's a hurdle.
very complex, and you have to be astute. You have to manage all 3 of those criteria, and of course, the pandemic didn't help that.
So how did the pandemic affect you guys overall? Obviously you guys are a boutique contractor, but you're doing a lot of different kinds of work in different asset classes. How did it affect you guys the most?
Well, during the pandemic, it affected everybody by shortages of material, labor, in all aspects. The volatility during that time in getting materials in, you'd have a contract that was awarded before the pandemic, and it just said you're going to deliver it in 12 months. And it didn't say, oh, but by the way, if there's a pandemic,
Right.
So most of our owners were very, very helpful. They understood, they invested in the volatility piece, which was both in cost and time. Sometimes it was not very easy. It was never good enough, but many of them we survived. It was a tough period. What I tell you that's interesting since then, and you see it when you go out to buy a car,
Hmm.
is the manufacturers have learned a new trick. And I don't know if this is a global thing. I would just say that at least in our world, they learned that the restraint of the supply side of supplying materials allowed them to keep their prices high. And even though they produced or delivered less quantity, their profits were equal to or greater than what they were when they were at full steam.
Mm-hmm.
So we have seen a new normal, and I'm not sure it's going to change. Which, like you're seeing at the car dealership,
Right.
it's now MSRP.
Right.
It's so you want to order a car, you pay full price.
Hmm.
We're seeing that as well, and concrete, for example, keeps going up in price, but the demand is softened.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because they didn't buy new plants, they didn't buy new trucks. They tell you this is the price per cubic yard, and then you call us a week or so ahead of time, and we'll put you in schedule instead of a day or two delivery. So,
I was fearing that would happen.
yeah, and they've learned this. This is something I don't see changing anytime soon.
It's getting harder and harder to build buildings.
Yes.
And obviously construction being one of them. But I think it's just I'm afraid that actually that will be the new norm. So I'm actually afraid that it's what you're saying is true, because then it'll just be for people like myself and even younger people getting into this industry. It's like it's just gets so much harder every time to do something. And you know what? I was wondering something. So you were saying back when you were starting to do all this, just out of curiosity, what were the permitting timeframes back then?
Oh gosh.
A week?
I mean, there was a period of time where you walked in and 2 days later you picked up the stamp set. I used to go into the old city hall that was imploded during the Die Hard or one of
the movie. Oh.
doing the movie. And I'd walk down there and I'll never forget her name, Dorothy, and she was the clerk there. And we'd go to the building official, the one building official, and you'd hand in a set of plans, and they might call you on the phone and say, "Hey, I got a problem with these couple things. If you can change these 2 sheets out and change this, you can come get your permit." And we walk down there, slip the sheets in, and get a stamp, and walk out with a set of plans.
Can we come back? Can we go back to that? Can we come back to that, please? Let's go back to that. Let's just go turn in plans. We have one reviewer gives us a call 2 days later. We make the swap. We walk out with the permit.
Yeah.
You know how many projects we could build?
Yeah.
In a year?
Yeah.
Right now, it's taking minimum 3 to 4 months, minimum.
Right.
Just for review.
I'm very well aware of that. And quite honestly, it's almost to a point that I hate to say it this way, but it's a restraint of trade. It impacts, and I have empathy for the municipalities because they're overloaded.
Yeah.
But they don't fully understand the economic impact to a client, which is the client has a note with interest carry on their land, waiting for a permit. That's costing them money for 3 or 4 months with nothing happening. We lose the cost, holding cost.
Right.
We have to reprice once the permit
Because you guys are contractors, when you bid something out, how long do you have to hold that price?
30 days.
Right.
So 3 months later, 4 months later, now pricing went up, or costs in different line items went up, and those impacts are now realized. And
most clients aren't buying their material 100% before they start construction. So it's not something you say, "Oh, let me reserve all my materials, buy them out, and then go through permitting." A lot of people don't actually do that, so it makes it even more difficult.
Well, some lenders won't let you. They won't let you do that. You have to get the permit before they'll give you a notice to proceed. So that becomes a problem. Now we've been managing the volatility by doing early buy with most of our clients. If they're underwritten, the bank's just waiting for a permit to close. We're doing early releases, and we're managing that. But you have to be, as we said a while ago, you have to be a real tight team member with the owner, the lender, and everybody. So the communication is very clear. What are we doing? How are we staying ahead of the issues? And how do we protect that volatility such that it doesn't impact the bank or the client?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge getting everybody to kind of sync up on the schedule of a project, especially for financing.
We're Invested podcast is produced by Atrium Management Company. Thanks for tuning in. And don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe.